Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it's a little bit something different. I'm going to be taking a deep dive into the films of the year 1990. This is actually a request for Bryan. He initially just wanted me to share my thoughts on a few different films from this year that I liked or I found to be underrated, and I decided to take things one step beyond and compile a list of over 200 films from this year and make this an entire video series. So this is going to be a multi-part video series where I take a look back at the films from this particular year, films that I've seen, films that I haven't seen, films that I didn't really know that much about. And I'm looking forward to this because I've always wanted to do a look back at a particular year in film, and this provides me that opportunity. So let's get started. So this starts off with a bang with The Adventures of Ford Fairlane. I think this is a fantastic film. For what it is, I think it's a riot, it's a romp, it's a really entertaining movie. It's the kind of film that doesn't give a fuck about your morals, doesn't give a fuck about offending you, and that's really refreshing in today's day and age, where you have a growing number of people who, let's be honest, folks, are a bunch of fucking pussies who can't take a joke and can't handle things without getting triggered on Twitter. So this film is like a giant middle finger to that sensibility. But it's not done in a way that feels like it's just really shallow or mean-spirited. It's done in a tongue-in-cheek fashion, and I think that goes a long way because this is something that I think could have easily completely blown up, and I don't think that's what happens with this film. It embraces a controversy, but it does it in a way where it's not taking things too seriously, but it's also not creating a story that is just nothing but really offensive jokes and not much else. This is a really unique blend of different genres. You have the action film genre, you have the comedy genre, and you also have comic book. This is a very comic book pulp kind of film. And I mean, just look at the poster. I mean, The Adventures of Ford Fairlane. I always love that poster. I think it's a great poster. It's gorgeous. And that really does mesh and match with the film really well because the film it's a comic book action comedy. A lot of the direction, a lot of the editing, it's exaggerated, but in a good way. And you have a lead in Andrew Dice Clay who is this larger than life comic book figure as Ford Fairlane. Perfect bit of casting. This is Andrew Dice Clay at the peak of his personality, his charisma, and his badassery. And it really makes this film such a wonderful and just hilarious experience just to see Dice at his best in a fairly big budget production. And he's not the only one when it comes to this cast that is doing their jobs really well. I mean, you have Wayne Newton who plays the bad guy, a really inspired bit of casting. Priscilla Presley, who you might recognize from various other films. You also have Lauren Hawley, who has a little bit role here. Ed O'Neill from Married with Children. He plays a police chief who's kind of hot on Ford's trail. There's a little bit of rivalry between the two. You have Gilbert Gottfried. You have Robert Englund. Freddy Krueger himself plays one of the main henchmen in this particular film. You also have other actors and actresses like David Patrick Kelly and Carrie Wurr. And the film has some really dynamic and quite amazing direction by Rennie Harlin. In fact, his direction was so good in this film that it caught the attention of 20th Century Fox. And that's why he was hired to direct Die Hard 2, is because some Fox execs, they saw the dailies for Ford Fairlane and they were impressed, and they thought, hey, this guy knows how to direct action. Let's ask him if he wants to do the movie. And I think that Fox execs thought that this was going to be a bigger hit than it ultimately wound up being, because at this particular time in 1990, Dice Clay was still a pretty big name. But for whatever reason, the film never really took off. But it did ultimately garner a cult following, and I'm definitely one of those cult members when it comes to the cult of Ford Fairlane. I fell in love with this film the first time that I saw it on VHS on a little tiny television when I was living with my dad in Oklahoma City. And it's one of those movies that just gets funnier and funnier each time I see it, and even more entertaining. Just talking about it, I just want to sit down and watch it again. It's easily one of my favorite films of this particular genre, one of my favorite comedies. And when I think of films from the year 1990 that are overlooked or underrated, it's near the top of the list. And it's also near the top of the list, period, when it comes to overlooked films for me. Because it's just has so many things about it that just really click. And it's just an awesome, really entertaining, fun movie. Now, the next film on here is a film that I've never heard of called After Dark, My Sweet, directed by James Foley. Stars Jason Patric, Rocky Giordani, and Rachel Ward. Bruce Dern is also in it. It's, I guess, about these three desperados who try to kidnap a wealthy child in hope of turning their lives around. It doesn't look like that's the plot by looking at the poster. The poster just makes it look like a generic erotic thriller. And it didn't really do that much. I've never seen it. This is the first time I've heard of it. It's a film that has definitely fallen in between the cracks when it comes to this particular year. But yeah, that's After Dark, My Sweet. The next one is Alice. Now, I put this one on here because I thought this was Woody Allen's Alice in Wonderland for numerous years. And it wasn't until recently until I actually did some research on this film and discovered that wasn't the case. Also, I wanted to use this particular platform here in this video to talk about why I really am not that big of a fan of Woody Allen. I don't get why Woody Allen is such a masterful filmmaker or writer. He gets all these really well-known big names in his films, but from what I've seen, I'm just really not that impressed with him. Maybe it's one of those things you had to be there at the time. Maybe it's one of those things where you see Woody Allen films and compared to the comedy, compared to the other films that were more prominent at the time his films were big and his films were being released, his films seemed to be of better quality, or they were more introspective, or there was more to them. But I don't know, I just never really got into his films. His style isn't really my cup of tea, and this film is definitely a weird one. You have Alice Tate, who's a mother of two. She has a marriage of 16 years, which starts deteriorating. She finds herself falling for a sax player. Uh, Apparently, she gets a really bad backache. She then consults some doctor named Dr. Yang, who I guess is some kind of oriental herbalist, or herbalist, sorry, who realizes that her problems are not related to her back, but in her mind and her heart, whatever that means. Dr. Yang's magical herbs give Alice wondrous powers, taking her out of her well-established rut. I had a little bit of a hard time finishing the sentence there because I'm really quite stunned by the shift in genres here with this particular film. All of a sudden, it's now some kind of fantasy. with Dr. Yang, and there's magical herbs. What did she smoke some pot? Is that what the magical herb is? I don't understand this. Um, you have Mia Farrow, you have William Hurt, you have Joe Mantegna, Alec Baldwin, Bernadette Peters, Judy Davis, Sybil Shepherd. Good cast, but I don't know about this plot, and I just don't know about it. Period. I've never seen the film, so I can't really say for sure whether or not it's bad or it's good. But I'm just not particularly that big on Woody Allen, so I probably wouldn't wind up being that big of a fan of it to begin with. So that's Alice. The next one is Awakenings. This is a depressing film, but it's a really good movie. This is a film directed by Penny Marshall. It stars Robert De Niro and Robin Williams. It features some of their best performances, if you ask me, especially Robin Williams. It deals with Dr. Malcolm Sayer, who is a shy research physician. He uses an experimental drug to awaken catatonic victims of a rare disease. It focuses on Leonard, who was the first patient to receive this treatment, and it's called Awakenings because the film, for the most part, is centered on Leonard and what happens when he awakes from the coma, when he wakes from his catatonic state and is subjected to what the world is now like after all these years. And it deals with the awe, the enthusiasm, and all of these other things. And it also centers around the relationship between patient and doctor. And I know it sounds kind of boring from my description and by the synopsis on here, but it's really not that boring of a film. It's got a really good heart to it, and just two legendary actors delivering equally legendary performances. And John Hurt is also in it. Penelope Ann Miller, Max von Sydow. Good cast, good direction by Penny Marshall. One of the better dramas out there. I'm not a super big fan of dramas, but Awakenings is one that I definitely would recommend. The concept alone is just very fascinating to me. The idea of people waking up after years of being asleep and their reactions to what the world is now like. That's such a fascinating story for a film, and just it's just fascinating period when it comes to anyone's real life tale. And this is, I think, loosely based on a true story anyway. So yeah, that's Awakenings. The next one is Air America, which is directed by Roger Spottiswoode. This is one that I think is a little underrated as well. You got Mel Gibson, you got Robert Downey Jr., and Tim Thomerson has a little bit role. Art LaFleur, Lane Smith, Nancy Travis. Michael Dudikoff is actually in it. Not a very big role, but he's in the film, as well as an actor like Marshall Bell, who you might recognize. This is a film that deals with Air America, which was the CIA's private airline operating system. It wasn't really a system. It was a private airline that operated in Laos during the Vietnam War. It was running anything and everything from soldiers to food for local villagers. And you have Billy Covington, who I believe is Mel Gibson's character. He gets recruited into it. He ends up in the middle of a bunch of lunatic pilots, gun running by his friend Gene, played by Robert Downey Jr., and opium smuggling by his own superiors. It's marketed as like an action movie, but I don't really think it's an action film. It's got some action sequences in it, but it's not really an action movie. It's more of a comedy, thriller. It's an interesting mix of different genres. It's It's a cocktail, so to speak. It's not a straight up action movie. It's been a while since I've seen it, but I do remember having fun with it, especially the banter and the back and forth with Mel Gibson and Robert Downey Jr. And just the overall premise, I thought was definitely a lot of fun. Something you don't see a whole lot of when it comes to this particular approach to the Vietnam War. I mean, there's a lot of Vietnam films out there, but there aren't that many that are taking this approach where they're focusing on a part of the war that is lesser seen and lesser known. So yeah, that's Air America. The next one is Almost an Angel. This is one I've heard of, but I've never seen. It stars Paul Hogan from Crocodile Dundee. You have Elias Koteas, who was Casey Jones in the 1990 Ninja Turtles film. Linda Kozlowski, who was in Crocodile Dundee. David Allen Greer from In Living Color and Amazon Women on the Moon. Jason Marsden in an early role. And it's directed by John Cornell. And it deals with this guy named Terry, who is a thief. He gets released from jail. He gets hit by a car. But while he's in the hospital, he has this dream that God visited him and tells him that he's an angel and he must start doing good things to make up for his past life. The usual sort of drama ensues where he doesn't believe it at first, but then he really starts to buy into it. And the film deals with all of that, with this former thief who thinks he's now an angel trying to do good. Charlton Heston also has a little bit role in it as well. And I've seen the trailer for it. It looked like it might be decent, but it was never really a film where I was like, man, I really want to sit down and watch this movie. Some about it just seemed to be a little too generic, a little bit too been there, done that when it comes to the storyline, so it never really caught my interest that much. But I've heard of it, but I haven't gotten around to seeing the film. And I'm not alone. It seems like it's a film that really doesn't have that much of a fan base. And it's not one of those movies that has a lot of people who know that it exists, let alone are that curious about it. But who knows? If it sounds interesting to you, if you like Paul Hogan and you haven't heard of this one, it would probably be worth a watch. And at the end of the day, I'm pretty sure it's not going to be bad. It's probably going to just be an average, all right movie. But I don't know. It's just one of those films that it's just the whole plot. It's just something I have seen before, often. The next film on this list is American Ninja 4, The Annihilation. This is one of the most disappointing films in the canon library because you have David Bradley, who was in American Ninja 3. Then you also have Michael Dudikoff, who was the first American Ninja. He was in American Ninja 1 and 2. And this film was marketed and advertised, as you can see by this cover, as the film where they are going to team up. It's going to be the two of them going up against a bunch of evil ninjas. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a lot of kick-ass action with double the American Ninja. But it's false advertising because they're barely even in the same screen as one another. And the action sucks. The villain is lame. He's talking about shit like licking his boots. And there's a super ninja who's like this ninja on steroids, but he doesn't do jack shit. And he gets his ass kicked pretty easily. And there's something to do with some ninja who's wearing a disguise, which I think he's disguised as either David Bradley or Michael Dudikoff. But it's been such a long time since I've seen it, I don't even fucking remember which is which. And yeah, I mean, look at the synopsis. The synopsis even says the two American ninjas, Joe Armstrong and Sean Davison, they team up to do battle against a terrorist and his band of ninjas. But they don't really team up. They team up for maybe like 2 scenes, if even that. And even what they do together is just really lackluster. Yeah, I was not a fan of American Ninja 4, The Annihilation. If you ask me, it's so bad it should be annihilated. So that's American Ninja 4. Then we have The Ambulance, which is another film that I think is quite overlooked from this particular year. It's directed by Larry Cohen. It stars Eric Roberts, Megan Gallagher, James Earl Jones, Red Buttons, Janine Turner from Cliffhanger, Eric Braeden, who was well known for his work on, I think, the soap opera The Young and the Restless. Stan Lee also has a little cameo in it because Eric Roberts plays a character named Josh who works for Marvel Comics. And the plot concerns Josh, who meets this young woman who is just basically unnamed because he doesn't know who she is. He just knows that he wants to be with her and he's attracted to her. She collapses. She gets taken away by an ambulance. He follows after her, but then he finds out that there's no record of her at the hospital. And this unravels this conspiracy involving this renegade group of doctors and really shady people who are going around and taking people in ambulances and doing experiments on them and so on and so forth. And this leads to Josh getting roped up into all of this, and this good deed of him just trying to check in on this girl, trying to see how she's doing, turns into him ultimately going on a rescue mission to save her. It seems like it might be kind of generic, but because it's directed by Larry Cohen, and I believe he also had a hand in the screenplay, it isn't. It's a funny film. It's got some really nice banter, especially for Red Buttons. And it's got the right amount of darkness, the right amount of edge to it. There's some genuinely fun set pieces in terms of the chases with the ambulance. And it's just a enjoyable film because Eric Roberts is a fairly likable and charismatic lead, and just the overall idea of this ambulance and this shadowy underground group that's grabbing people is quite effective. And overall, I would recommend this one. It's one of those movies where it definitely isn't super serious, but that's to its advantage. This tongue-in-cheek approach that Larry Cohen is so good at is something that really does lend itself well to this particular plot. And yeah, overall, I think it's one of the more underrated films from this year. It actually has a Blu-ray by Shout Factory, so it's one of those films where you can definitely get a hold of it fairly easily. And if you are a fan of Larry Cohen's films like Q, The Winged Serpent, or others, should definitely check out The Ambulance. You'll be in perfect health before you die. So yeah, The Ambulance. Then we have Angel Town, which is a film directed by Eric Carson. Stars Olivia Gruner, Peter Kwong, Teresa Saldana, Frank Aragon, James Carreras. Mark Dacascos has a little role. It's not a very big role, but he is in the film. This is a really fun, low budget martial arts film. You have Olivia Gruner, who plays this graduate student and martial arts expert who rents this room in a house owned by a single mother and her son. There's a street gang that's trying to recruit the son, but then there's this new guy who's at the apartment who tries to help the boy's mother keep him out of the gang. When the gang realizes this, they target both the mother and her new tenants, and this leads to Olivia Gruner taking it upon himself to kick some ass and take some names. And with these kind of films, the plot isn't really the most original thing out there. But what makes these films so entertaining and enjoyable is the action. And this film has a ton of action. Some really fun fights, some good fight choreography. Olivia Gruner is not the best actor in the world, but he can definitely hold his own when it comes to the martial arts. So if you're looking for a fun, cheap martial arts movie with just tons of punching and kicking, Angel Town is definitely one of those films that I think will satisfy your thirst for that kind of entertainment. So that's Angel Town. Then we have another 48 Hours, which I actually like this a little bit more than the first film. The first film is still a classic. It's still a really fun, exciting, entertaining, enjoyable action movie. Very revolutionary when it comes to the buddy cop genre. But I always thought the action in the first film was a little mediocre, to say the least. With this one, you get the same chemistry between Eddie Murphy and Nick Nolte, but you also get souped up, more intense, and not necessarily original, but definitely unique action scenes when it comes to how they are approached and how they're shot. The film apparently was cut to shreds by the MPA or the studio, so it is kind of a fractured movie when it comes to how things play out ultimately in terms of the story or certain characters. Like Brian James was supposed to have like this huge role, and he's barely even in the movie. But in the original cut of Another 48 Hours, he's in it for a lot longer, and he has way more sequences. But that being said, I mean, the cast is great. I mean, not only do you have Eddie Murphy and Nick Nolte who come back to play the same roles of Jack Cates and Reggie Hammond, you have Brian James, you have Kevin Teige, who was in Roadhouse, you have Edo Ross, who was in Red Heat, you have Andrew Divoff, Bernie Casey also has a little role here, and Walter Hill comes back and directs it, and once again still maintains that same excellence when it comes to the action sequences, when it comes to the fire on screen between his two leads. And I think this is an underrated sequel. I don't see a lot of people talking about Another 48 Hours, and I think that's too bad because I do. I think it's a better film than the first film. Sue me. I like the first movie, but if I were to pick a 48 Hours film to watch, I would pick Another 48 Hours. I think the villains are better too. No offense to the actors and the people in the first movie, but I think the villains here are a little bit more intimidating. And I think it's a more satisfying film when it comes to its action. And comedy, it's not quite as funny as the first, but it's still fun and it still has its moments of hilarity. So, yeah, Another 48 Hours is a film that I definitely would recommend. I think it's one of the more underrated sequels out there. And for some reason, it still hasn't gotten a Blu ray. What is up with that, Paramount? It's not that bad. So that's Another 48 Hours. Then we have Arachnophobia. This is one of those movies that grew on me. And by grew on me, I really had this love-hate relationship with this film growing up because I definitely had arachnophobia as a kid. So this film would give me the heebie-jeebies. It would creep me out. I could barely watch it because of all the spiders and everything. It's one of those movies that definitely did scare me quite a bit as a kid. So it was this love-hate relationship with arachnophobia. I still remember vividly watching this on VHS at my grandparents' house in Arizona, and in the middle of the movie, a big ass giant spider showed up on the wall in the room that I was staying in. So I was just freaked out. Okay, I was understandably freaked out, and there used to be this really eerie trend that would happen every time I would watch this movie after that night, where I'd put on Arachnophobia, and like clockwork, a spider would show up. Like I'd see a spider on my wall, or I'd see a spider crawl out of some space somewhere. But thankfully, that trend stopped fairly recently. I watched the film on Blu-ray and didn't see any spiders. And it's one of those films that I think it's a really good film for what it is. It's a PG-13 thriller done the right way. It's got its genuine moments of suspense and scares, but it's also got some entertaining, tongue-in-cheek, fun moments as well, where you have John Goodman's character, who's the exterminator, and I really like Jeff Daniels' character in this. It was really refreshing to see a character who is this scaredy cat, who is this guy who is just afraid of spiders to the point where he's paralyzed. But as the film goes on, he gains this ability to not be as afraid anymore and to kick some spider ass. So, and I've always liked Jeff Daniels, and it was really fun to see him as a lead. And the rest of the cast is good too. Harley Jane Kozak, Julian Sands, Brian McNamara, Stuart Pankin. I thought the direction by Frank Marshall was fantastic, especially when it comes to the spider sequences. When they could do the spider scenes with real spiders, they did it with real spiders, and that's what really amps up the heebie-jeebie factor. Like in the climax when they're in the house and there's spiders everywhere and they're coming down from the ceiling. That's all real spiders, if I remember correctly. Spiders coming out of the sink, real spiders. Nowadays, a lot of this would be done with CGI and it would look fake as fuck. So, Arachnophobia is one of those films that is definitely a product of its time, but in a good way. I think it's aged well, and I think it's the best spider movie. When we're talking about films about spiders, to me personally, Arachnophobia is the one that gets the A plus. Arachnophobia is the one that is at the top of the web, so to speak. But I could see why some people weren't ultimately that big on it, but I've always been a fan of it, even when I hated watching it because I was so scared of spiders. So, yeah, that's Arachnophobia. Then we have a film called Avalon. This does not ring a bell either. This is directed by Barry Levinson, and apparently it's the third in a semi-autobiographical series of Baltimore films. You have Diner, you have Tin Men, and Avalon, Liberty Heights. It's set in Baltimore in the early 50s, explores the themes of Jewish assimilation into American life. Stars Eve Gordon, Lou Jacoby, Armin Mueller-Stahl, Elijah Wood, Kevin Pollak, Elizabeth Perkins, Joan Plowright, Aidan Quinn. I remember reading about this and seeing that it was a massive bomb. I think it didn't do that well in the box office. But other than that, that's all I really know about it. It just doesn't look like my cup of tea. I'm not big on dramas, folks. I'm really not big on dramas. And this looks like one of those movies. It's just one big, long drama about American life and this family in 50s America. And it just doesn't really intrigue me that much. But that's Avalon. And then we have, I'm going to see, yeah, let's finish up the letter B here, and then I'll probably call it a video. So we have the next one is Bad Influence, directed by Curtis Hanson, starring Rob Lowe, James Spader, Lisa Zane. This is a film that I reviewed on my channel already. It starts off really good. It's got a lot of potential, but then it ultimately blows it in the end. I don't think it really lives up to its full potential. I think it's got some issues when it comes to its screenplay. That being said, it definitely has its moments. It deals with this executive who's a wimp, played by James Spader, which is a nice bit of casting against type because James Spader was well known for playing these cocky asshole executives. And in this film, it's the opposite. He is about to get absolutely destroyed by this guy at a bar when a stranger steps in and saves him from this ass beating. And the stranger is played by Rob Lowe, which is another bit of casting against type. Later that night, Michael runs into the stranger. Then they form this relationship, they form a friendship, and it starts to cause Michael's life to spiral out of control. Hence the title Bad Influence. Curtis Hanson's direction is good. There's some good performances, some nice bit of style when it comes to the art direction and the production design. But I just think the story is lacking. It's lacking an extra gear. And I've already spoke at length in terms of my issues with the film in my review. So if you're curious about that, go ahead and look up my review of the film. But if it's something that interests you and you like the cast, check it out. Who knows? You might like it more than I did. So that's Bad Influence. Then we have Back to the Future Part 3. I know there are a lot of people who think that this is the worst film in the series, and I get that. I understand why. But I'm such a Back to the Future nut. I still love this film. I grew up watching this on VHS along with the first and the second film, and I still think it's a really fun, lighthearted blast from the past. No pun intended. And it definitely does help that you got Zemeckis. You still have Christopher Lloyd and Michael J. Fox being as endearing as ever in their roles as Marty McFly and Doc Brown. And then you have some newcomers in Mary Steenburgen. And I thought the love story between Mary Steenburgen's character Clara and Doc Brown, I thought it was genuinely charming, and I thought they had some good chemistry. And I'm not super big on westerns, but this film hits all the right buttons for me when it comes to a western. And I think in large part it has to do with these characters. I just love these characters. I love Marty McFly. I love Doc Brown. And I love this franchise. So it being a western still works in ways that I think it wouldn't have if it was some other movie that had nothing to do with the Back to the Future franchise. But I have to admit, if I were tied down and forced to admit which one is the least great when it comes to the series, Part 3 would definitely be my choice, but it's still an enjoyable, fun ride nonetheless, and I don't think it's quite as bad as some people make it out to be. I know it's gotten sort of a recent reputation as being a really lame, disappointing sequel, and I respectfully disagree with it. I don't think that that is really accurate when it comes to this film. But I do have to admit, it's not the best trip when it comes to this franchise, when it comes to the trilogy. But it's still a good one. Still worth a ride in the DeLorean and going back in time for. So that's Back to the Future Part 3. Then we have something called Betsys Wedding. Not my cup of tea. I'm not really big into these romantic dramas. But the reason why I added it to the list is it's directed by Alan Alda, who you might recognize. He's done things like MASH and other movies. But look at the cast. You got, not only do you have Alan Alda, you have Molly Ringwald, you have Joe Pesci, you have Catherine O'Hara, you have Ali Sheedy, you have Samuel L. Jackson, Madeline Kahn, Burt Young, Anthony LaPaglia, Dylan Walsh. It's a really good cast for a film that has an incredibly generic title and a movie that I had never heard of until now. It deals with this fashion student named Betsy Hopper, who I think is played by Molly Ringwald, and her straight-laced investment banker fiance Dylan Walsh, who that's really not the character's name, it's just played by Dylan Walsh. They want an intimate little wedding reception, but Betsy's father Eddie, who's played by Alan Alda, feels so threatened by Jake's rich parents that he blows the ceremony up into a bank-breaking showpiece, sending his wife Lola into a financial panic. And yeah, by the synopsis, it doesn't really sound like much. It doesn't sound like it's a marriage made in heaven, so to speak. But I wanted to mention it because of the cast. I mean, Samuel L. Jackson, Catherine O'Hara, Joe Pesci, Molly Ringwald, Ali Sheedy. So yeah, that's Betsy's Wedding. Then we have a film that's marketed here as Crossing the Line, but it's actually known as The Big Man, directed by David Leland. And this stars Liam Neeson, who plays this bare-knuckle boxer. You also have Joanne Whaley, Billy Connolly, Hugh Grant, Pat Roach. And the film didn't do much. In fact, the film was a pretty big bomb. It's been forgotten about for the most part. I only know about it because I picked up the VHS a couple years ago because I do like Liam Neeson and I like boxing movies. And this is one I had never heard of until I saw the VHS at a store and decided to pick it up. I haven't seen it yet, but it's a movie that apparently is one of the reasons why Liam Neeson, there was something involving Darkman and how he wasn't able to do something, some scene or something they weren't able to do. I'm trying to remember correctly whether it was a reshoot or whether it was something or another, but there was some sort of complication because he had to go and shoot this film. But yeah, I can see why. I mean, if you just saw it by this title, Crossing the Line, and just by this poster makes it look like a cheap direct-to-video or made-for-TV movie. Also, it doesn't sell the film properly. Crossing the Line, it doesn't need, there's no semblance or reference to boxing at all on this poster. But the original poster art and the original box art for this film, when it was known as The Big Man, it shows him in boxing duds and boxing gear. So it's the proper advertising. But it's just a weird thing. Like, why did you need to change the title? And what the hell does Crossing the Line have to do with boxing? So yeah, that's The Big Man. Then we have Blood Salvage. This is a little bit of a gem as well. This is a fun direct-to-video, low-budget horror comedy in the vein of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It does not have a DVD release. I don't even think it's even available to stream. It says it has a disc on Amazon. I think what they mean is there's a laser disc that's available or some bootleg, because there's no official release of this film on home video other than VHS and Laserdisc. You have this redneck family who kidnaps people off the highway and performs these medical experiments on them, sells their organs to the black market. But one of the things that makes this film stand out is it deals with a handicapped lead. April. She's in a wheelchair and she's the hero. And that's really unique in this kind of film where you have a girl in a wheelchair who is the lead in this horror comedy. Evander Holyfield also has a role in it. Yes, that Evander Holyfield, the boxer. John Saxon, you have Danny Nelson, Laurie Birdsong. I think Laurie Birdsong is the one who plays the girl in the wheelchair, if I remember correctly. Ray Walston, directed by Tucker Johnston. It's got some decent bits of gore here and there, although it's not the goriest film out there. But there's enough there to get the point across. And it's got some fun chase sequences, and just the overall mood, atmosphere, and vibe of it, I thought was a nice blend of redneck fuckery, in terms of them being silly and over the top, and some genuine creepy elements. And the whole wheelchair heroine, I think that definitely does put it in another category. And in a good category, if you ask me. I would actually recommend checking this one out. I think it's definitely worth a watch. I don't think this one should be forgotten about. I would love to see this get a release from Vinegar Syndrome or some company like that, because I think it's one of those films that is really ripe for a release from that kind of company. So, Blood Salvage. Then we have Bird on a Wire. This is one that I haven't seen yet, but I've been wanting to for a long time because of the cast. Mel Gibson, Goldie Hawn. I love Goldie Hawn. I'm a huge fan of hers. And Mel Gibson, I like him too. So you have those two together in a buddy caper film of sorts. John Badham is directing. David Carradine's also in the cast, along with Bill Duke and Joan Severance. And the trailer made it look like a fun movie when it comes to the action, their back and forth, their personality, and their chemistry with one another. And I think it did all right in 1990 in terms of the box office, but it seems like a film that's been fairly forgotten about despite it doing fairly well when it came out. You have an FBI informant who keeps his new identity secret for 15 years, but then he's recognized by an old girlfriend, and the bad guys are the villains. I think David Carradine's one of them, and they are essentially out for revenge. They are going to try to take out Mel Gibson's character, and there's going to be a lot of hijinks and action that ensues. It's a film that I definitely am going to watch one of these days because of these two, but I've never really gotten around to seeing it, so I can't really say that much else about it. But if you like those two and the trailer looks like it might be fun, I would probably recommend it. So that's Bird on a Wire. Then we have a film called Prisoners of the Sun, which is known as Blood Oath, directed by Stephen Wallace. The reason why I wanted to mention this one is it takes place in World War II, in Japan. Actually, it's not in Japan. It's on a Pacific island just north of Australia, where the Japanese Empire has started up a prisoner of war camp for Australian soldiers. And it stars Bryan Brown, George Takei, in a very different role for him. I think he plays a bad guy in this, although I haven't seen it in a while. Terry O'Quinn is also in the film. Deborah Kara Unger, Russell Crowe in one of his earlier roles. It's an interesting film to watch for the different cast members, for the premise, for the setting, and specifically for George Takei, to see him act outside of his wheelhouse. This isn't him doing a sci-fi film. This isn't him doing a comedy. This isn't him just playing Sulu again. This is him trying to flex his acting muscles, and it's worth a watch for that alone. So that's Blood Oath. Then we have Blue Steel, directed by Kathryn Bigelow, starring Jamie Lee Curtis, Ron Silver, Clancy Brown, Louise Fletcher, Elizabeth Pena. Tom Sizemore also has a small role in it. This is one of those movies that, to me personally, is a little disappointing. good concept, some good performances by Jamie Lee Curtis and Ron Silver and others. Catherine Bigelow's direction is fine, but as a thriller, it's kind of lackluster. It loses steam, and it's not a total dud, and it doesn't always fire blanks. But when it comes to the rounds that it manages to fire off, there are way too many blank bullets than there really need to be. It's a film that I remember being disappointed by. It's been years since I've seen it, but I still would like to revisit this one of these days, just for the cast, for the premise with Megan Turner, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, plays this rookie cop who gets involved in this robbery, and then there's this witness who becomes obsessed with her. I think it's Ron Silver, and it's Jamie Lee Curtis versus Ron Silver. But I remember it being a little disappointing when it comes to how things ultimately unfolded. And this is one of those movies where I felt that it could have been better. But I still would recommend it because of Jamie Lee Curtis, because of Catherine Bigelow's direction, Ron Silver, the late Ron Silver. And yeah, it's not a great film, but it's decent. But that's the thing. I think it could have been a great movie. And the fact that it's just average is definitely a letdown. So that's Blue Steel. Then we have the Bonfire of the Vanities. I haven't seen the film. I've heard about its disastrous production. There's an entire book about how crazy this film was when it comes to what was going on the set. It's directed by Brian De Palma. I think it's based on a book of the same name. Stars Tom Hanks, Bruce Willis, Melanie Griffith. You also have Kim Cattrall, Morgan Freeman. The film, though, was a box office bomb. It did not do well in the box office. It wasn't this big Oscar bait film like I think De Palma or others were hoping that it would be. And it's got this reputation of being one of the worst films of this year. Critics gave it scathing reviews. I still haven't seen the film. I'm curious about it for the cast and for De Palma because this is not his kind of film. He normally doesn't do dramas. He's a guy who's more well known for directing thrillers. So it'd be interesting to see what he had in mind for a drama. But yeah, Bonfire of the Vanities. Haven't seen it, but I've heard about it. I know it has this crazy backstory. So it's a film that I probably will eventually watch. And I do want to get that book that talks about the making of it because it sounds like it might be a really fun read. Just to see just the insanity of everything involving this movie. It's one of those films like when you think about the title, when you think about the subject matter, when you think about the plot, it's not one of those movies you would think would have this tumultuous, insane production. You'd be like, really? That's the movie that had this crazy behind the scenes backstory? But apparently it is. And I love that kind of stuff. So even if the movie winds up being as bad as the critics make it out to be, the behind the scenes, the backstory, that will be well worth it. So that's the Bonfire of the Vanities. Then we have Brain Dead. This is a film directed by Adam Simon. It's like a Twilight Zone-esque story, which is fitting because it's written by one of the original contributors to the Twilight Zone, and I think it's Charles Beaumont. And it deals with this corporation who has these megalomaniacal ideals, and you have Bill Pullman and Bill Paxton. So you have the two Bills together on screen. Bud Cort's also in it, and it's a low budget sci-fi horror film with some nightmare imagery like this. But it's definitely a lower budgeted movie. I haven't gotten around to seeing it yet. I did pick it up on Blu-ray recently, but I've always been curious about it because of this cover. I always thought this poster was pretty cool, to be honest. And for the two Bills, I mean, Bill Pullman, Bill Paxton in the same film together, count me in. So yeah, that's Brain Dead, directed by Adam Simon. And then we have, speaking of weird movies, you have The Bride of ReAnimator, directed by Bryan. This is one of the better sequels out there. I think Bryan did a really good job capturing the same insanity, the same inspiration that was shown previously by Stuart Gordon in the first film. It's arguably even more zany, even more over the top when it comes to its effects, when it comes to its plot line. And this is one of those sequels where it does ultimately take things to a bigger and even more perverse and just absurd direction. And I've always enjoyed Bride of ReAnimator. It's one of my favorite sequels. You have Jeffrey Combs, who once again comes back to play Herbert West, a role that he was born to play, and it's like he never really left. It's like they just picked up right when ReAnimator stopped shooting. Bruce Abbott's also here. David Gale, he comes back. How? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I'm fine with it. Kathleen Kinmont, she plays the Bride of ReAnimator, such a trooper when it comes to the makeup, and this is a real showcase for makeup. That's one of the big things why I like it. I can see why some people might think that it's a bit of a retread of the first film, but I enjoy it for its madness, for its makeup effects, and for its demented sense of humor. Yeah, I've always been a fan of Bride and ReAnimator. I recommend that one for sure. Then we have By Dawn's Early Light, and I'm going to end this particular part of the video with this one. It's a TV movie. I think it premiered on HBO. It's directed by Jack Shoulder. It stars Powers Booth, Rebecca De Mornay, James Earl Jones, Martin Landau, Jeffrey DeMunn, Darren McGavin, Peter McNichol, and I think it's based on a book, but I'm not 100% sure. It's one of those films that deals with the anxiety and the fear around the Cold War or nuclear Armageddon. So you have this warhead that gets launched by Soviet insurgents who were protesting the essentially the end of the Cold War, and it destroys the city in Ukraine. The destruction sets off a race between American and Soviet politicians to prevent a nuclear holocaust. While the U.S. president feverishly works to keep the military and political machine from going into overdrive, various other people in the ranks, they start to panic. The president is believed to have been killed in a helicopter crash, and this causes advisors who are under him to take over, and they don't have the same mindset as the president does. They are like, nuke him, take him out. Now, I haven't seen this film, but I've seen the trailers for it, and it looks like it might be a decent movie. It looks like a film that might be one of those movies that will definitely make you pretty anxiety ridden when you're watching it because of how close to home it is. Even though we are no longer in the Cold War, the threat of nuclear Armageddon, the threat of this war game between the United States and other countries, that hasn't gone away. It's still very much something that I think a lot of Americans, a lot of people in general in the world can attest to. This is still a pretty big fear that somebody could strike America or strike another country, start a world war, and everybody would be fucked due to nuclear Armageddon. And this film at least seems like it's taking a different approach than a lot of films like this do, where it's more talking about the setup, like the a potential scenario where we get close, like it could happen, and it almost does, or maybe it does. I haven't seen the film, but it's one of those things where it focuses more on what leads up to nuclear Armageddon or potential nuclear Armageddon instead of what happens after. And a lot of films of this type tend to just focus more on what happens after, and it's understandable. but this is one of those films that takes a different approach. So anyway, that's it. That's it for this particular installment of my look back at the year of 1990. I'm going to pick up where I left off, and we're going to start with Cadence, a film starring Charlie Sheen, directed, I believe, by his father, Martin Sheen. And that will be the next film that I will be covering for this particular video series. Didn't mean to give you a quick glimpse at my desktop background there, but it is what it is. But anyway, once again, thanks goes to Bryan for requesting this particular topic. And I hope you enjoyed the video. And as always, I'll see you later. See ya.